Welcome to Story Planet, where every story is a quiet companion, and even the smallest moments hold gentle magic. Ink, Rain, and the Porch Light is a tender love story about silence that speaks, letters that linger, and the warmth of a heart slowly finding home. Get cozy, relax, and let the story gently unfold. Perfect for unwinding before the night, or whenever you need a moment of calm. Shall we begin? The wind whispered through the tall pines, like a memory being carried home. It was late afternoon when Mira arrived. The cottage stood quietly at the edge of a hill, tucked beneath an old walnut tree, with ivy climbing up its stone walls like time wrapping around a memory. The sky above was a soft blue, streaked with the fading gold of the sun beginning its descent. In the distance, the hills rolled gently into one another, quilted with wild grasses and the faint outline of a winding path. Everything felt still here, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty, but waiting. Mira stepped out of the car and closed the door gently, as though not to disturb the peace that clung to the place like morning fog. She stood for a moment, her fingers resting on the handle of her suitcase, and simply looked. The cottage was smaller than she expected. 2 windows on each side, white curtains fluttering behind the glass, a dark green door in the middle, like a quiet smile. A wooden sign by the gate read Thistlewind. The name alone made her feel as though she had stepped into a story she hadn't yet heard the beginning of. She had come here to write, or more truthfully, to begin again. It had been nearly a year since the breakup, since the city had started to feel too loud, too fast, too filled with familiar places that now carried unfamiliar ache. Mira had tried to stay. She had tried to move on. But something inside her had stopped blooming. So she packed a few things, left behind the apartment filled with half-finished pages, and followed an ad for a hilltop rental that promised quiet, views, and a little bit of healing in every sunrise. The key had been left in a terracotta pot by the doorstep, exactly as promised. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and was greeted by soft light falling through linen curtains, shelves filled with old books, and the gentle smell of lavender and pine. The cottage wasn't new or fancy, but it was warm, honest, the kind of place that welcomed you without asking too many questions. She let her suitcase rest by the door and walked over to the window. From there, she could see the back garden, wild and untamed, with purple sage, golden yarrow, and a small wooden bench under a fig tree. Just beyond the hedgerow stood another house, older, with ivy-covered bricks and tall, narrow windows. Its shutters were half open, and smoke curled from a small chimney. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't exactly look lived in either. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Mira noticed movement in the garden next door. A man, tall, with silver threads in his dark hair, was tending to the plants. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though each step had meaning. She watched as he bent down to prune a rose bush, then gently brushed soil from his hands. He didn't look up, but she wondered if he knew she was there. The days that followed unfolded like a soft melody. Mira settled in, let time slow around her. She woke early, took long walks on the winding path behind the hill, brewed tea with cinnamon and honey, and tried gently, patiently, to write again. The words didn't come quickly, but they began to stir. Every morning, she'd sit at the kitchen table with a notebook, staring at the blank page. The stories were still inside her. She could feel them fluttering like moths in the quiet. But her hands hesitated. The ink paused. It was as if her heart was waiting for something to begin before it could speak. And each day, from her kitchen window, she saw the man in the garden. He was always there, tending plants, sweeping leaves, placing small stones in neat lines by the walkway. Sometimes he wore a wide-brimmed hat that hid most of his face. Other times he moved through the garden barefoot, as if he belonged more to the soil than the world beyond it. They never spoke, not once, but something gentle passed between them in the stillness, a quiet recognition, as if both carried stories too heavy for words, but still understood the rhythm of someone else's silence. One afternoon, as gray clouds gathered over the hills and the air smelled faintly of rain, Mira returned from her walk to find something by her front step, a small terracotta pot, inside blooming lavender, fresh, purple, fragrant. A tiny note was tucked beneath the soil, not signed, just a single line in neat handwriting. For peace. When the days feel too loud. She stood there for a long moment, holding the pot in both hands, heart full in a way that surprised her. She looked toward the garden next door. The man was there, as always, trimming back the wisteria vines. Their eyes met briefly. He nodded once, then returned to his work. That evening, as rain whispered on the windows and the world turned soft and silver, Mira found another surprise, a mug, still warm. Left on the small table just outside her front door, cinnamon tea with a hint of lemon. Her favorite. She hadn't told anyone. A smile crept onto her lips. She carried the mug inside, held it close, and curled up by the fireplace. The tea tasted like memory and kindness. She didn't know his name, he didn't know hers. But already they were speaking. In gestures, in presence, in the quiet spaces where words would only get in the way. On the fourth evening, Mira sat at her desk, looking out at the dusk settling over the hills. She lit a candle, let the soft glow spill onto the page, and wrote her first sentence in months. Some stories begin not with a voice, but with a look. A pause, a kindness left by the door. She placed the sentence carefully in her notebook. Then, after a moment of thought, tore out a small sheet and wrote a new line. Thank you for the lavender. And the tea, it meant more than you know. She folded the paper, walked out into the cool night, and placed it on the windowsill facing the garden next door. Then she waited. The moon rose quietly over the hill. The stars blinked into view. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out into the night. And inside the cottage on the hill, Mira felt something shift, not loud or sudden, but gently, like the earth turning beneath her feet. The morning after she left the note, Mira woke earlier than usual. The mist still clung to the hill like a hush, and the sky held that soft lavender hue only found at dawn. She didn't open the curtains right away. Instead, she made tea. Slow, quiet, almost reverent, as if she were preparing for something sacred. She stood by the window for a while, hands wrapped around the warm mug, watching, waiting, hoping. And then, just as the sun peeked over the hills, she saw it, a small envelope, resting where she had left her note. Her breath caught in her chest. She opened the door gently, heart fluttering like a leaf in wind, and picked it up. The paper was thick, the handwriting familiar now, neat, steady, deeply human. Thank you for seeing what most pass by. That was all it said. But in those 8 words, Mira felt something settle in her chest, not weight, but warmth. They didn't exchange names. Not yet. But letters began to flow, slowly, one at a time, each one folded with care, left between windows, tucked beneath flower pots, perched on the edges of things like birds finding a place to rest. The first ones were simple. Short lines about the weather, about a bird's nest tucked under the eaves, about how good the rosemary smelled after the rain. Then came questions, little ones at first. Do you write in the mornings or at night? Have you always loved lavender? Do you ever dream in color? And Mira found herself answering, more honestly than she had spoken in months, maybe even years. Their letters became confessions wrapped in calm. She wrote of her old apartment, where the heater groaned in winter, of the coffee shop that knew her order, of the man who had once held her heart then walked away. Elias, though he hadn't yet signed his name. She knew it now from one of the notes tucked under her teacup, shared pieces of himself too. He wrote of a brother he hadn't seen in 10 years, of a dog that used to follow him to the river, of quiet mornings when the world still felt whole. Mira found herself looking forward to each morning, not for the sunrise, but for the paper she might find, and what it might hold. The notes became longer, handwritten pages folded delicately, his words looping across the lines like vines along a trellis. Sometimes his letters were poems, small and unfinished, as if he was letting her peek into a room not yet swept clean. One read, I planted seeds today, not just in soil, but in silence, and hoped one might bloom in you. She had read that one over and over, then fell asleep with it tucked beneath her pillow. She began writing back with her heart wide open, no longer just recounting her days, but wondering aloud, dreaming, remembering. Do you ever think some souls are meant to meet only after they've been broken? She wrote once. He didn't answer that one directly, but his next note was 3 pages long, about a sunset he once watched alone from a rooftop, and how he wished someone had been there to see the sky burn gold. Another letter arrived tucked into a folded map, hand-drawn trails showing his favorite walks through the woods. And in the corner, he had drawn a tiny star with a note. This spot has the best view of the valley. If you sit there long enough, you'll feel it breathing. She went the next day, wrapped in her scarf, notebook in hand, and she stayed there until the light turned soft and blue. That evening, her reply was short but certain. I felt it, and I think it felt me too. Their words never said the word love, not once, but it was there, between the lines, in the careful way they spelled each thought, in the pauses, in the pages left blank on purpose. There was a tenderness building, like rain collecting in the petals of an unopened flower, and with it, a trust growing slowly but deeply. One day, Mira stepped outside to find a small book left on the garden bench, her name, written in delicate script on the first page. Inside were pressed flowers, poems, and sketches of trees, of cups of tea, of a woman standing by a window. It was Elias's way of saying, I see you, not just now, but always. She cried, not from sadness, but from the quiet relief of being known. It rained for 3 days straight after that, and still, their letters came, folded in waterproof paper, tucked in dry corners, and once, hand-delivered, slipped into her palm when they passed each other by the garden gate for the first time. No words were spoken, only a glance, but in that look was every letter they'd ever written. She carried that glance with her for days. As spring deepened, their exchange slowed, not from loss, but from depth. Some days she would leave nothing but a pressed petal or a line of poetry. Some days he left her a mug of tea with steam swirling like a question. Their letters lived less in ink and more in presence, in understanding. And slowly, Mira's writing returned, not the same as before, but fuller, richer, colored by every quiet thing they had shared. She found her characters speaking softer but more honestly. Her stories breathed with new life. She finished a short story, printed it on soft cream paper, and left it by his window. No title, no signature, just the words, "For the one who reminded me that silence can bloom." And when she passed the garden the next morning, there were new tulips planted along the edge of the bench, bright yellow, blooming toward the sun. And for the first time, she smiled without wondering if it would last. The weather had been restless for days, a hush before the storm. Clouds loomed like bruised silk across the horizon, and the air held the scent of something waiting to be released. Mira watched from her window, fingers curled around a warm mug of tea, the kind Elias had once left when the rains first came. The sky trembled with tension, a low hum that echoed through the hills, and she felt it too, that inner stillness before something shifts. She had just finished lighting a candle, its flame small but steady, when the power flickered once, then again, and went out completely. For a moment, there was silence. No refrigerator hum, no buzz from the old lamp near her desk, only the soft ticking of the wall clock and the growing whisper of wind outside. She stood there, wrapped in her cardigan, staring at the quiet, and realized she was trembling, not from fear, exactly, but from uncertainty. The kind that wraps around you when you're alone, and the dark stretches longer than you expected. She thought of the garden and the man next door, the man whose letters had become chapters in her own healing, Elias. She whispered his name for the first time aloud, surprised by how it felt like both a question and an answer. Another gust of wind swept across the hill, rattling the windows, and in that moment, Mira stepped toward the door, heart beating a little faster, not from fear, but from something braver. The candle in her hand cast golden circles along the hallway walls as she stepped outside. The garden was cloaked in shadow, the moon just a sliver behind the clouds, and every branch swayed like it knew a secret. She walked the short path between the two cottages, the gravel soft beneath her slippers, her breath visible in the cooling air. She reached his door, lifted her hand, and knocked. The door opened slowly, and there he stood, Elias in a soft gray sweater, hair slightly tousled, eyes gentle but surprised. For a second, neither of them moved. Then he stepped aside, no words, just space, given and accepted. Inside, his home was warm, simple, filled with wood and books and the soft scent of something earthy. Candles flickered on the mantel, and the fireplace crackled, low and welcoming. She stepped in slowly, as if entering a memory. He gestured toward a chair by the fire, and she sat. Elias poured tea from a black kettle and handed her a mug without a word. Their fingers brushed. A current passed between them, not electric, but grounding. They sat in silence. Mira curled her hands around the warmth, the storm beginning to murmur against the windows. The logs in the fire cracked inside, like the house itself was breathing with them. Then, softly, he spoke. "I hoped you would come." The words were barely above a whisper, but they rang louder in her than any letter they had exchanged. She looked at him, really looked. Lines near his eyes spoke of years both kind and hard, his presence steady, as if he had weathered more than one storm. "I didn't want to stay alone in the dark," she admitted. "Me neither," he said. There was a pause then, but not the empty kind. It was filled with the shared knowing that something had shifted. A bridge crossed, a door opened, and neither of them wanted to step back. He stood, walked over to a nearby shelf, and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. "I wrote something today, but it didn't feel right on paper," he said. He handed it to her. Inside was a poem. Some silences are sacred, not empty, not hollow, but full of things still becoming words, and some nights are meant to be shared without needing to be explained. She read it slowly, then again, then closed the notebook and held it to her chest. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The storm grew louder outside, but inside, there was only the sound of rain and fire, and two people, no longer needing paper between them. Elias reached for another candle, placed it on the table between them, and in the flickering glow, Mira felt her shoulders loosen, her breath deepen, her heart grow still. They talked then, gently, softly, about little things, books, memories, favorite kinds of weather, and one story she had never shared with anyone, about her grandmother's lullabies, and the way they used to make her believe that even the darkest nights had stars waiting to be found. He listened, not like someone waiting to speak, but like someone welcoming her words home. When the candle burned low and the storm began to fade, Elias stood and walked her back to the door. They paused there, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a soft blanket. He looked at her. "You're always welcome," she nodded, smiled, then turned, walking slowly back to her cottage. That night, Mira didn't light another candle. She didn't need to. The light had already found her. The storm had passed by dawn, but its memory lingered in the air, in the way the leaves shimmered with leftover rain, in the hush of the soaked earth, in the birds that sang softer than usual, like the world was catching its breath. Mira stood at her window, watching the pale gold sunlight spread slowly across the hills, like a secret being shared gently, 1 inch at a time. She hadn't slept much, but she wasn't tired. The night had unfolded in soft threads: candlelight, tea, conversation, and something deeper, something unspoken that had curled into the corners of her heart and made itself at home. She touched the edge of the empty mug on her bedside table, the one Elias had given her, and smiled. She stepped out onto the dewy path, slippers soft against the damp earth, a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders. In her hands, 2 mugs of tea, the kind with cinnamon and a touch of honey, one for her, one for him. She didn't knock this time. She found him already sitting on the porch, elbows on his knees, looking out at the garden like he'd never truly seen it before. When he turned, there was no surprise in his face, only warmth. She handed him the tea and sat down beside him. For a long time, they didn't speak, and they didn't need to. The garden glistened, petals heavy with droplets, the tulips nodding toward the earth. A pair of doves flew overhead, their wings catching light, and somewhere in the trees, a breeze stirred the leaves into a gentle rustle. Mira wrapped her hands around her mug, the warmth seeping into her palms, grounding her. It felt like everything in the world had slowed just enough for them to notice it. And that, somehow, felt like love. "I used to think silence meant distance," she said softly, not looking at him. "That if someone wasn't speaking, they weren't feeling. But you've shown me it can mean something else, something more." Elias didn't answer right away, but she felt him glance toward her. "I used to fill every quiet moment with noise," he replied eventually. "Music, television, anything, just to keep the stillness out. But then I came here, and the quiet stopped being empty." She turned to him then, their eyes meeting in the middle of a morning that felt like it belonged to no one else. "I think we were both waiting for something," she said. "Or someone," he added. Their hands brushed on the railing, not by accident, and neither pulled away. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather a confirmation of something they had been quietly building since the first bloom of lavender on her windowsill. The way his pinky finger slowly hooked around hers was all the answer she needed. They talked for hours that morning, in slow circles, like walking through a garden path with no real destination. He told her about the first time he'd seen her, suitcase in hand, how he'd almost gone to say hello. But something in her face told him she needed space. She told him about the fear of not being enough, of always feeling like she was only as worthy as the words she could put on a page. He shook his head gently. You were enough the moment you stopped looking at the paper and started looking out the window. Her throat tightened, not from sadness, but from the truth in his words. By midday, they were still sitting there, the tea long gone, but neither moving to leave. It was like their bodies knew what their hearts had only just begun to say out loud. Mira eventually leaned her head on his shoulder, and he didn't move, just adjusted slightly, so she could rest more comfortably. The birds kept singing, the breeze kept dancing, and the silence between them bloomed. Later that afternoon, they wandered into the garden together. Elias showed her the rosemary he trimmed each morning. The way the mint always tried to take over the herb bed, the spot beneath the old oak where he sometimes sat with a book and let time forget him. She told him which flowers reminded her of her childhood, which trees she'd always imagined growing outside her imaginary house as a little girl. They laughed, soft and surprised, like discovering new languages only they understood. Back inside, Mira noticed a wall lined with Elias's journals, dozens of them. He shrugged. I write to hear myself think, she smiled. I write to understand what I'm feeling. They sat by the fireplace again that evening, the fire slow and steady, casting gold across the walls. He pulled out a small notebook, handed it to her. I stopped writing letters when we started talking, but this one, I never sent. She opened it. It was dated the day after their first letter exchange. I think I'm already beginning to care for you, it read. Which is foolish, perhaps, but some things begin before they're allowed. And some people make the silence feel like home. Tears welled in her eyes, and she didn't hide them. She reached for his hand, and this time she held it. That night, she stayed. Not because it was storming, not because she was afraid of the dark, but because the dark no longer felt alone, because the quiet now had company, because some hearts find home not in grand declarations, but in the gentle act of being seen and staying anyway. In the early hours, long before dawn, Mira sat on the porch alone for a moment, Elias asleep inside. She looked out at the garden, the path, the stars blinking above the hilltop. She thought of how everything had changed, without anything being forced. A lavender plant, a note on a windowsill, a cup of tea, and now this quiet joy. She would write again, of course. She would fill pages and pages with characters and places, and maybe one day tell this story too. But for now, she would live it. She stood, stepped back inside, and curled beside him, their breathing slow, matching. And as sleep found her, Mira smiled. The light between them wasn't a flame. It was a knowing. Thank you for listening. If you felt something gentle in this quiet journey, consider giving it a thumbs up and sharing it with someone whose heart might need a little stillness too. For more stories that slow time and soothe the soul, subscribe if you haven't already. Good night and sweet dreams from Story Planet.